Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're going to tackle a concept that's been, debated for centuries, civilian control of the armed forces.
Yes.
It's like a cornerstone of any democracy.
Absolutely.
But as you'll see, it's way more complicated than just like stopping a military coup.
Oh, yeah. Much more to it.
Right. We're using a chapter from the Paul Grave Encyclopedia of Global Security Studies,
Okay.
specifically the chapter on, well, civilian control of armed forces to really dig into this.
A great source. It's a fascinating topic. Has been, well, a concern for so long, actually. I mean, even in Plato's Republic.
Oh, that far back.
Oh, yeah. You see this tension already, right? You need a strong military, obviously. States need that for defense and all. But that strength, that very strength could, threaten the government itself. It's like a constant balancing act, this guardianship dilemma.
I like that. Guardianship dilemma. So you're trying to make sure you've got security without, what, undermining the whole system.
Exactly. It's the system you're trying to protect, right?
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So hold on. We're not just talking about, like, preventing, what, tanks rolling down the streets, taking over the Capitol.
No, not just that. It's much broader.
Okay, so what does civilian control actually mean now in the modern world? Like, what are we really talking about?
It's about civilians making the key decisions. About defense, I mean.
Huh?
Everything. Setting the budget, deciding what weapons to buy,
Oh, wow.
shaping the military structure,
Oh.
even influencing internal military affairs. Can you imagine a scenario like where the military just decides its own budget?
Oh, that's a scary thought.
Right, and chooses its own weapons without any civilian input. No,
That's
that's
not a democracy.
not at all. That's a recipe for, well, trouble.
Yeah, I can see that. Wow, I hadn't thought about it like that. That's interesting. So this whole idea, this concept of civilian control, has it like always been understood this way?
No.
Or has it changed?
It's evolved quite a bit, especially since the Cold War ended.
Oh, interesting.
Back then, civilian control was mainly about preventing coups, military coups. But now the emphasis is on what scholars call democratic control.
Democratic control.
Yeah. It's not enough to keep the military out of politics.
Okay.
You need them to operate within a democratic framework.
So they're in the system.
Exactly. With transparency, accountability,
Right.
public oversight, like any other powerful institution.
So it's like before we were trying to keep them behind a fence. And now it's like, okay, you're in the house, but you got to follow the same rules as everyone else.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They have to be integrated, so to speak.
Okay, so how do we know if a country actually has strong civilian control? Like, can we measure it?
Absolutely, we can.
Yeah.
Scholars use, well, there are three main approaches: institutional, behavioral, and attitudinal.
Three approaches.
The institutional approach, that one focuses on the rules and structures, governing civil-military relations. Think of like blueprints
Blueprints.
for a country's defense setup.
Got it.
Does the legislature have, like, real power over the military budget? Are there strong civilian-led defense ministries? These are the kind of questions you'd ask.
So it's about the formal mechanisms, the ones on paper.
Yeah, exactly. The formal mechanisms of control.
Okay. What about the behavioral approach?
So that one is more about, what actually happens on the ground. Less about the rules, more about observing. How do civilian and military leaders actually interact?
Okay.
Especially when they disagree. Who wins those battles? Do civilian leaders, stand their ground, or do they just cave? Michael Desch, he's a prominent scholar in this area. He argues the level of civilian control really depends on the types of threats a country faces.
Oh, interesting.
For example, strong civilian control, he says, is more likely when a country has high external threats, but things are pretty calm internally.
So if you've got a powerful enemy across the border,
Right.
but things at home are pretty stable, everyone's like unified against the common enemy.
Exactly. That's when you're more likely to see civilians formally in charge.
Makes sense. So what about when those internal threats go up? Does the military get more, like, assertive?
Yeah, that's exactly Desch's point. When internal threats are high, like civil unrest, political instability, the military might see an opening.
Oh, I see.
They might feel like they need to step in, restore order, they might say.
Yeah, like we've seen that happen.
Throughout history, internal divisions can create opportunities for the military to step in.
That's fascinating. Okay, so we've got the institutional approach looks at the rules, behavioral approach looks at the actions. What about the third one, the attitudinal or cultural approach? What's that about?
That one goes deeper. It's about the hearts and minds of the military. their beliefs about their role. Do they really buy into democratic norms? Or do they just comply when it's convenient? It's like, the difference between someone who says they respect the speed limit
Right.
and someone who actually believes it's important for everyone's safety.
Yeah, yeah, I get it. You can have all the rules, but if they don't really believe in it,
Then what?
it can all fall apart. So how do researchers figure out what the military really believes?
They analyze doctrines, they conduct interviews, they look at training materials. James Fitch, he's a prominent researcher in this area, he compares military cultures across different countries. He's trying to understand, do these militaries see civilian control as legit or just something they got to do?
Okay, yeah, that's a big difference.
Right. Like they have no choice, so they go along with it.
Hmm.
But do they really believe it?
Right, right. Okay, so understanding those underlying beliefs, that seems crucial for really figuring out if civilian control is going to last, right? In any democracy.
Absolutely. It's about the long-term health of the system.
Okay, so we know how to measure it, but how do you actually make sure it happens? What are some of the strategies countries use?
Two main categories: strategies that weaken the military's ability to intervene, and strategies that reduce their willingness to do so. Think of it like training a dog. You can use force to restrain them. But building trust, positive reinforcement, that often works better.
Right. I like that analogy. So weakening their ability to intervene. Are we talking about making them weaker?
Not weaker overall, but strategically limiting their capacity to act against the government. Dividing the military into branches, maybe, that can kind of counterbalance each other. Deploying troops far from the capital. Or even suppressing communication between units.
So making it physically harder for them to stage a coup, even if they wanted to.
Exactly. Putting up barriers.
Okay, I can see how that would work. But couldn't that backfire? I mean, if you weaken them too much in the name of control,
Right.
couldn't you make them less effective at their actual job? Defending the country, I mean.
You've hit on a crucial point. That's exactly the dilemma.
Right.
You don't want a military that's too strong to control,
Yeah.
but you also don't want one that's too weak to do its job. It's a delicate balance.
The delicate balance, yeah.
And a lot of experts believe that just weakening their ability to intervene, it's not enough. You got to address the willingness too.
Okay, so let's get into that. How do you reduce their willingness to, meddle in politics? That seems trickier than just moving troops around or whatever.
It is trickier, but potentially more effective, long-term, I mean.
Okay.
It's about shaping their mindset,
Yeah.
their culture, instilling a deep respect for democratic principles, fostering a sense of professionalism, where they prioritize national defense, not political ambitions.
I see. So they're the experts, masters of strategy, tactics, all that.
Right.
But they don't get involved in deciding what those strategies and tactics are for.
Exactly. Samuel Huntington, he's a prominent political scientist. He argues for what he calls objective control. The idea is you emphasize professionalism. You create a clear separation between military and politics.
So they're like a doctor focusing on healing the patient, not trying to run the whole healthcare system.
That's a great analogy. It's about focusing on their core competencies.
Makes sense. But how do you cultivate that kind of mindset?
It's not easy. It's a long-term process. Rigorous training. Emphasize ethical conduct. Instill a strong sense of duty, loyalty to the Constitution, not any particular leader or party.
Right. Not to a person.
No.
To the system.
Okay. And you also need to, integrate the military more with society so they don't see themselves as separate.
Exactly. They're part of the democratic fabric, not a separate entity with their own rules.
Makes sense.
And you need oversight mechanisms, strong ones. Think parliamentary committees, independent audits, civilian experts within the defense ministry. It's checks and balances, multiple layers of scrutiny.
So they know they're being watched.
Yeah.
That there are consequences for stepping over the line.
Right. It's about incentives and deterrence. Reward good behavior, promote those who exemplify democratic values, make it clear that there are penalties for breaking the rules.
Okay, that's starting to make a lot of sense. But it's complex. Are we expecting, everyday citizens to grasp all this and hold their leaders accountable? That's a great point. It highlights another challenge. For civilians to be effective at oversight, they need knowledge.
Oh, right.
They need to understand the military, its capabilities, its limitations, its culture, how it makes decisions. It's like anything else in a democracy.
Yeah.
You need an informed citizenry.
That's true.
Yeah.
So you can't just want civilian control. You need to understand what it is, how it actually works.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Before we move on to looking at, specific examples. I want to pause here. From all of this, what's the most important takeaway? What should our listeners be thinking about as we keep going?
This is key. Civilian control is vital, absolutely vital for a functioning democracy. But it's not automatic. You can't just assume it'll happen. It demands constant attention,
Hmm.
careful planning,
Huh.
and a deep understanding of this relationship between the civilian and military spheres. It's dynamic. It's a constant balancing act. And ultimately, it's up to all of us as citizens to make sure it stays strong.
That's a good point to think about. As we start looking at how different countries have tried to achieve this balance, we'll be back with more in part 2, our deep dive into civilian control of the armed forces.
Looking forward to it. It's like it never stops. This idea of civilian control being a dynamic process, always evolving. It's not a box you can check off and that's it.
It's a constant thing. You're always working on it.
Right, exactly. It requires constant, vigilance, adaptation.
It's almost like a living thing, isn't it? This relationship between, civilian leaders and the military.
That's a great way to put it. You got to nurture it, tend to it. It's always adjusting to new things.
Right. New challenges,
Yeah.
circumstances.
Yeah. And the source material, it actually gives us some insight into how, different countries have tried to get this balance right between a strong military, but also a strong democracy, like Costa Rica, for example.
And Costa Rica.
They abolished their army all the way back in 1948.
No army at all. Wow, that's a big statement. I mean, it definitely shows they're serious about civilian control, but how do they even defend themselves?
Well, they have a police force. It's small, and a Coast Guard.
Okay.
And they put a lot of emphasis on diplomacy, international cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, they chose demilitarization. Like, it's part of who they are.
Is part of their identity?
And it's worked for them. They've had peace, stability, without a traditional army.
That's amazing. It shows there's no one right way to do this.
Absolutely not. One size fits all. No way. It all depends. The country's history, their political culture.
Right. What kind of threats are they facing?
Exactly. Their region, all these factors.
So many factors, yeah. So what about the countries that do have a standing army?
Right.
How do they walk this tightrope? Security and democratic control.
Well, one approach that's pretty common, especially in countries, moving away from authoritarianism, is called military professionalization.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that earlier, right? With, what's his name? Huntington.
Huntington, yeah. Focusing on making them experts, but discouraging them from getting into politics.
Right. But how does that actually work in the real world?
It's about creating this culture of professionalism, nonpartisanship. You reform their education system. You have clear rules, regulations. You promote officers based on merit, not their political connections.
Okay, yeah.
You really emphasize accountability, ethical conduct, trying to create a military that sees itself as serving the nation, not any particular party or ideology.
Makes sense. But changing a whole culture like that, that's got to be tough, right? It takes time.
It does. It's not easy. And it's not, a guarantee against coups or anything. We've seen plenty of cases where this professionalization, it falls short. Even with all that training, you can't completely eliminate the risk that some faction within the military might get tempted to intervene.
Especially if things are going badly.
Yeah. Like if they see the civilian government as incompetent, corrupt, or if there's a major crisis, they might feel like they need to step in.
Like they have to save the day. It's like, even if you have a really well-behaved dog, right?
Right.
They see their owner in danger, their instincts might take over.
Exactly. And that's why just professionalizing the military, it's not enough. You also need strong civilian institutions.
Right, to keep things in check.
A strong defense ministry that's independent. A legislature that's willing to use its oversight powers.
Okay.
Civil society, you got to be active and engaged. All these things play a role in maintaining civilian control.
It's complicated.
It is, yeah. It's like this whole ecosystem.
Right. It's not just one thing. It's the institutions, the culture, the people. It's a lot to keep track of.
No wonder it's so hard to get right.
Exactly.
Right.
So each country has its own obstacles, right? Like what are some of the common ones?
Well, one that comes up a lot is expertise. We talked about how civilians need to have a certain level of knowledge to really oversee the military effectively.
Right. You need to know what you're doing.
But that can be hard to achieve, especially in democracies where leaders come from all sorts of backgrounds. They might not have any experience with defense matters.
Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't want someone with no medical training performing surgery, would you?
Exactly. Some things require specialized knowledge. And overseeing the military, that's one of them.
Right. If civilian leaders don't understand, like, strategy, doctrine, technology, even the culture of the military.
They're going to struggle to make good decisions
Mm.
about defense policy or to hold the military accountable. Imagine trying to negotiate some complex arms treaty, but you don't even know how the weapons work.
Yeah, you're going to get taken advantage of.
Or trying to reform the military justice system, but you don't understand their procedures, their norms. It's a recipe for disaster.
I see the problem. So how do countries deal with this expertise gap? Do they, like, send all their politicians to boot camp?
Not quite. Although some basic military education for civilian leaders, that wouldn't hurt. But there are other ways. Professional development programs for civilian defense officials. Give them the training they need, the resources. Some countries have specialized advisory bodies, think tanks, research institutions.
To provide that expert advice to the civilian leaders.
Exactly. It's about creating this support network, this knowledge base, so they're not just, making decisions in the dark.
Right, they're not flying blind.
Exactly. And it's also about communication, open communication, dialogue between civilian and military officials. Trust is so important, especially when you're talking about sensitive issues, like use of force, how to allocate resources.
It's any relationship, right? You got to be able to talk to each other openly, honestly. Listen to what the other side is saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've got the expertise challenge. What else? What other obstacles do countries run into?
Right. What else makes this so tricky?
Resources. Effective civilian oversight, it takes money. Training programs, research, staffing for those oversight bodies, it all adds up.
Yeah, things cost money.
And if a country's already struggling to meet their basic needs, it's hard to prioritize something like civilian oversight, even if they get why it's important.
Yeah, you got to pay the bills first.
That's where political will comes in. Even if they have the money, it won't happen unless the leaders are committed, both civilian and military. You got to have laws, sure, but you need leaders who are going to actually enforce those laws.
They have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Right, and create a culture where civilian control is just the way things are done. It's the norm, not the exception.
It's like anything else in a democracy. You got to put in the work. Be vigilant. Make sure those institutions are working right. That power is being used responsibly.
Absolutely. And you know what? One of the hardest things is dealing with the legacy of authoritarianism.
Oh, yeah. If a country has a long history of, military rule or interference, it must be hard to change that.
It's a deep-seated culture, impunity, distrust, rebuilding trust, reforming those institutions, establishing new norms. It all takes time.
It's like trying to change the course of a river. That's been flowing the same way for centuries.
That's a great analogy. It takes real effort, strong leadership, and a willingness to face the past, to confront those ghosts.
So out of all this, what actually works? What are some of the things that have helped countries achieve successful civilian control? Like, are there patterns?
There are some things that come up again and again. A strong, independent judiciary, for one.
Ah, the courts. I hadn't really thought about that. How do they fit into this whole picture?
They're a check on both sides.
Yeah.
The civilian leaders, the military, they make sure everyone's playing by the rules, accountable to the law.
So like a referee in a sports game.
Exactly. They call the fouls, doesn't matter which team.
Right. Keeps things fair. Okay, so the courts can step in if the military tries something.
Right.
Or if the civilian leaders get out of line.
Exactly. It's about balance, making sure neither side can just dominate the other.
Right. So they can really prevent abuses.
Yes, especially if the military is trying to grab power or if civilian leaders want to use the military for their own, political purposes.
Okay, so an independent judiciary, that's key. What else?
Robust civil society. We talked about that a little earlier.
Right, right. Why is that so important again?
It's about having these independent organizations, individuals, actively watching the government, holding them accountable.
Like watchdogs, making sure everything's running smoothly.
Exactly. Human rights groups, media outlets, think tanks, universities even, just everyday people who are willing to speak up.
Okay, yeah. They can raise awareness, do research, advocate for changes, keep those leaders in line.
Exactly. They inform the public, shape opinions, hold everyone accountable, both civilian and military. Think about like investigative journalists exposing corruption in the military or human rights groups documenting abuses. Without a strong civil society, those things might stay hidden.
Right, it wouldn't come out. So that's really important. Okay, so we have strong courts. We have a vigilant civil society. What's the last piece of the puzzle?
Culture. A strong culture of democratic values, democratic norms.
So it's not enough to have the right laws, the right institutions. The people themselves have to believe in democracy.
It's foundational. For civilian control to really work, it has to be part of the fabric of society. Respect for the rule of law, human rights, peaceful transfer of power. People need to understand the role of the military, but also that they answer to civilian authority.
So it's like, you can have the best house in the world, but if the foundation is shaky.
The whole thing could crumble.
Exactly. So we're
Right.
not just talking about a technical thing here or a legal thing. It's really about the core of democracy.
It is. It's something you have to constantly pay attention to, work on. It takes a shared commitment to those democratic values.
This has been really interesting. I feel like I'm starting to get it, all these complexities. But before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with something to chew on. We've talked about countries that already have a military, but what about the ones that are just starting out, building their military from scratch, or transitioning from authoritarian rule? What are their challenges?
That's a great question. Starting fresh or trying to reform a system that's been so steeped in authoritarianism, it's a whole different ballgame. We'll explore those in the last part of our deep dive.
Yeah, it's like a whole different set of challenges, right? Starting from scratch. We're trying to fix a system that's been broken for so long.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
But it's also an opportunity, isn't it?
Oh, how so?
Well, they get to build it right from the ground up. They could bake those democratic principles right into the very DNA of their armed forces. It's like designing a house, and you put the security features right in the blueprints from the beginning instead of trying to add them on later, when things are already going wrong.
Right, right. So you're being proactive. But where do you even start when you're basically creating a military for a brand new democracy?
Well, the legal framework, that's got to be clear right from the get-go.
The rules of the road.
Yeah, the roles, responsibilities, both civilian and military. A constitution that says very clearly civilian control.
Yeah.
Laws that cover everything: recruitment, promotion, use of force, oversight, accountability.
So everyone knows what the boundaries are,
Yeah.
right from day one.
Exactly. And it's got to be done transparently, inclusively. You need everyone at the table, not just the military leaders, but civilian experts, political parties, civil society. Everybody's got to buy in.
Especially in those countries transitioning from authoritarianism, right? There's probably a lot of distrust between different groups.
Oh, yeah. They need to feel like they're building this thing together.
Right. It's a shared project. It's not just one group dictating to another.
Exactly. It's a new social contract. Everyone understands the rules, accepts them. But it's not enough, just to have the laws, the structures.
What else is there?
Trust. You got to build trust.
That's harder.
It takes time. Open dialogue. Honesty. Because imagine, after years of, military rule, it must be tough to just suddenly trust them.
Yeah, to just flip a switch and say, okay, we trust you to stay in your lane now.
Right. It's going to take time,
Yeah.
transparency, and a real effort from both sides.
Okay, so beyond the laws, beyond the trust building, what else is important when you're setting up a military for a new democracy?
Well, think about recruitment. Who are you going to bring in? What kind of people? What values do they have? What do they believe?
Yeah, that's a big one. You're shaping the future of your military. That's a lot of responsibility.
It is. If you want a military that's truly committed to democracy, you need people who believe in that. Might have to rethink how you recruit. Target young people from different backgrounds. Offer education. Really stress that civic duty part of service.
So it's not just about like physical strength, combat skills, all that. It's about attracting people who understand democracy, who value it.
You want a different kind of recruit. And then there's training, education. What are you going to teach them?
Yeah.
What kind of mindset are you trying to create?
It's like you have this blank slate, right?
Right.
You get to mold them into the soldiers you want.
That's a good way to put it. And those democratic principles got to be front and center, woven into everything. The training, the leadership development, ethical decision-making, it all has to be there.
So it's not just about how to shoot a gun, how to march in formation. It's about how to think,
Yeah.
how to be a responsible citizen in a democracy.
Exactly. You're giving them the tools, not just weapons, but the values, the knowledge. They need to operate in a democratic society. You got to develop a whole new curriculum, train the instructors, create this culture where those values are reinforced over and over.
This is all great in theory, but I'm thinking about those countries, with existing militaries, with a history of authoritarianism. Can you really change a culture like that?
It's harder, for sure, but not impossible. History shows us militaries can be reformed. They can go from being, instruments of repression to actually defending democracy.
That's good to hear. So how does that happen? What are some of the things that work?
Well, one approach is what they call vetting or
Yeah.
purging. You remove the officers who are involved in human rights abuses or those who are, like, totally loyal to the old regime, the ones who are going to resist change.
Get rid of the bad apples so the reforms can actually take root.
That's part of it. But you also have to look at the system. The institutions that gave the military so much power in the first place. Might have to change the Constitution, reform the defense ministry, create new oversight mechanisms, make those lines of authority really clear. Civilian leaders, military leaders.
So it's about changing the whole system, making it harder for the military to overstep, to get involved in politics.
Exactly. It's a huge job. It takes political will, expertise, resources, but it's a chance to build something better, a military that's more professional, more accountable.
A military that actually reflects those democratic values.
Yep, one that serves the nation, not an ideology, not a faction. A military that understands its place in a democratic society.
That's the goal, right?
It is, to have a military that's a source of strength, security, but that also respects and upholds those democratic principles.
Well said. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've covered so much. Defining civilian control, looking at the challenges, the opportunities all over the world. As we wrap up, any final thoughts?
Civilian control, it's not a finish line. It's a journey. It's always evolving. It's a conversation between civilian and military leaders. It's shaped by everything. History, culture, politics, even technology. It takes work, it takes adaptation, and commitment from both sides to make it work.
It's something you have to keep working at constantly, and it's not just up to the experts, the politicians. We all have a role to play, right?
Absolutely. Stay informed, engage in the conversation, hold our leaders accountable, push for policies that strengthen our institutions. Because the stakes are high. The future of democracy depends on this, on getting civilian control right.
It's a challenge, but it's one we have to face.
It's a conversation we need to keep having.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through all of this. It's been really eye-opening. And to our listeners, we hope this has made you curious, inspired you to learn more. Because as we've seen, this is crucial. Understanding and ensuring civilian control of the military, it's essential for protecting democracy and building a better world, a more peaceful world, a more just world.